It's always a pleasure to be here, and thank you everyone for coming. We really appreciate everybody being here. So I just want to share a few comments before we get started here, and I'll be turning it over to Ian Sharp with Jay Fuller, who actually did all the very detailed flood modeling for the Tusayan area, and he'll get into the technical pieces of that and what it means relative to a local floodplain. But most important key message here is that floodplains mapping and floodplain activity needs to reflect the actual risk, the real risk, whatever that risk is. Some areas it's very limited, very little impact. In some areas, unfortunately, like Tusayan, there is a significant risk. And unfortunately, much of the FEMA floodplain mapping that was done 30, 40, some even 50 years ago, and this is true all over. We went through the same type of experience in Munns Park. I mean, people have been through the experience. Flagstaff, where the old maps were created with basically zero technology. And a lot of times we talk about how it was just somebody sat down with a Sharpie and pulled some map from somewhere and thought they knew where the floodplain went. And many of you know we've been through a lot of history here with Tusayan, but what became really clear that a couple of years ago that we really needed to, we being the flood control district, really needed to understand what is the flood risk, because we knew, everybody was speculating. It's 2,000 CFS, it's 5,000, it's 7,000, it's 10,000. All the speculation was going on. And it was time to stop speculating and use the very good science that we have today and very good people that know how to manage that science, like Jay Fuller Hydrology, to really assess what the risk truly is. And that's what we're reflecting here is with the current modeling. And there are development impacts. There will be and are going to be development impacts. And because the risk, the risk is very different than the risk that had been assessed 40 years ago. So, we're not trying to hide that, but this isn't about, this is about reflecting the risk accurately. It's not about preventing development, enhancing development, or anything in between. Our focus is, are we reflecting the risk accurately so that future development is knowledgeable of that, aware of that, and we spent, frankly, a couple $100,000 generating this science so that when people do develop, the basic science is done. They can take that science, hand it over to their own engineer, and develop a plan. And our intent is to work as closely as we can with the property owners in Tusayan and move forward with a local floodplain now, knowing that it's probably at least a 3 to 5 year process. In Munns Park, we decided to go through a FEMA remapping, and that was turmoil. We are in our 13th year, and the maps will become effective in January. And that just created tremendous turmoil, creates tremendous turmoil around properties, and so we've made a decision to move forward and bring this to the board. We've met with the board. We met with the board on October 14th. I believe that presentation is online. If it is not, I'll make sure that it is by tomorrow. And the recording of that meeting with the Board of Supervisors and the board, including the chair who represents this district, represents Tusayan, was very clear that she said we may or may not have a legal obligation to represent the risk accurately, but we have a moral imperative to do so and to represent that risk to people's lives accurately and then to move forward. And I think I really, again, always want to applaud the town for taking the step to go out and get the State Transportation Board grant, and now we're moving forward with the mitigation. And I can tell you, There are properties that are in the FEMA floodplain now that will also be in the local floodplain when that, if the board chooses to put that in place, which they've signaled to me, they want to stay on track. They want to move ahead with this. In the session that we had, the feedback was continue to move ahead, stay on track. You know, that go from having anywhere from 10 to 15 feet of floodwater on their property down to 3. And so if you know anything about developing in a floodplain, that's a big difference, what you have to do. And so, and not every property is affected that much, you know, but there are properties that are highly impacted, and will be if we have a major flood event. So this, for us, this is a public safety project. That's what this is. This is a public safety, modifying the regulations to reflect a public safety effort and initiative. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ian. That's going to talk through what was done to create these maps and the results and why and what it means and what it doesn't mean. I think one thing to know that we are still targeting taking it to the board on December 9th. And that means that the public notice has to go out either, well, by the 9th of November, basically. And our attorney is preparing that, the language. I think there's some anticipation that this is going to be a big regulatory difference in the regulations. I think John Carr, who's with our Community Development Department and manages the National Flood Insurance Program, what is it, John? It's a couple of sentences, right? It's basically going to provide the district the authority to establish local floodplains anywhere in the county that we believe that that risk warrants having a local floodplain. And so it's providing for that authority. The regulations that will be applied in the local floodplain will be identical to those that are being applied now in the FEMA floodplain and all FEMA floodplains within the county. So we're not changing the actual specific regulations, and I think there's been a lot of concern that the regulations are changing, but the regulations themselves, right, John? I'm saying this accurately, and Ian has been very much a part of this too, working with the attorney, that there's, you know, the requirement, for example, and 1 foot over base flood elevation is going to be that regulatory requirement still. We're not making it 5 feet. We're not changing that. And the need for no adverse impact, that is in our floodplain regulations now. And that's addressed in FEMA now. And so those properties that are in the FEMA floodplain now, they are required now to use the best available data. And the best available data is the current modeling. And so if you're not in the FEMA floodplain now, this is a change, and it is a big change for those parcels that weren't in the floodplain, in the FEMA floodplain, that are now being a local. That is, there's a change, and this will impact that property. Nobody's up here to deny that. There is going to be an impact. But it's reflecting the risk accurately. That's the key piece here, so key message. So with those pieces, I'm going to turn this over to Ian, and do you want me to put that on for you? Sure. Maybe easier if I try to do it. Let's get it turned the right way. If I can get it to work. There it goes. All right, try that and see if that works.
Can you guys hear me? Is that working? Perfect. Thanks, Lucinda.
And we are recording this, and both audio and video we're recording, and it will be available, if not tomorrow, the following day. Erin's very good about getting the product over to me pretty quickly. And I've now established separately, and we've got flyers. If the flyers get handed out to everyone, they're over here. 2 things that are important to know. One, we've established a separate page on the Flood Control District website specific for the local floodplain. Now, we're going to move all the products there. We had a new product created just literally got done yesterday. A new product created working with our GIS department. We did a similar type product for Munns Park that was very well received there. That will provide a lot more detail for each product, for each parcel. You'll see the overall flood depths across the property, and you can look at points and look at the flood depth and other more detailed information. So all information that's in the feed in the J Fuller study now, but this is much easier for the public to use. It's a put your cursor over kind of, applications, technology application. And it's easy to use, and you can go over your property or any other property and look at it, see them like that song. So same information, all public information that's there. So but we've got flyers with that link on it, and that link will be on that new webpage as well. So
Thank you, Lucinda. So my name is Ian Sharp. I'm a civil engineer with J.E. Fuller Hydrology. I've been with J.E. Fuller for a long time, and I've worked with several agencies throughout the state dealing with floodplains, both FEMA and local. So I'm going to talk about the local floodplains, what they are, what they mean, how we got here, and please interrupt me if you have any questions along the way. I'd rather just answer them along the way. So what we have here, there's two different floodplains shown here. The light blue area there, it goes up and down here. You're very familiar with it. That's the existing FEMA floodplain, the Zone A floodplain, that approximate flood hazard area. The larger hatched area that goes up in these tributaries and the bigger area, that is the new local floodplain. And then the purple area, yeah, this purple area, that is the local floodplain. And then where they intersect each other, it shows up as a third color, but there's two floodplains. And so, if you're in this property, you're in a Zone A. If you're in this property, you're in the local floodplain. If you're in this property, you're in both. And I'll explain a little bit more about that. And as Lucinda mentioned, a Zone A floodplain, it's an approximate floodplain, and it was most likely delineated 40, 50 years ago on paper maps, USGS quadrangle maps, 10-foot contour, 20-foot contour intervals. Whether or not they had hydrology that help them define the discharges and the flood extents, we don't know. FEMA's not given that information to the district, and they probably don't have it. It's been lost to time. And what's very likely the case is somebody recognized there is a floodplain here, we're just gonna go ahead and draw it on a map. And they drew it on paper maps. And then over the years, those paper maps were digitized. About 20 years ago, they were digitized, and that was great. It put it in a digital environment for us, but the problem is there was a lot of translation issues and issues where floodplains are not where they belong, and this is a great example. This breakout floodplain over here, that's actually a hill right there. This is the valley, so the floodplain's in the wrong spot. And we see that all over the place with these Zone A floodplains, so they give you an idea that you're in a floodplain, but they kind of give you a false sense of what that floodplain is. So knowing that, the district reached out to J.E. Fuller and contracted with us to do this study. So our study, and many of you are aware of it, but our study was this hydrology analysis where we looked at this 59 square mile watershed, and that's a relatively large watershed draining to the town here. And we looked at how does this watershed react? And we spent a lot of time going out there trying to understand the soils and how, if rain falls in this watershed, how does it respond? And we know that there were different questions about if it rains, what is that discharge? And we did this study, and I hate to say this, but thankfully for us, there was that 2023 flood event that we're all aware of, and that helped us calibrate our models and come to the conclusions we've come to. So the model that we did comes up with design discharges throughout the watershed, through the town here, upstream, all over the place, for recurrence intervals, so for the 2-year, the 10-year, the 50-year, 100-year, 500-year, these design intervals that we as engineers love to use. We have discharges. So we can tell you at the wastewater treatment plant, the 10-year discharge is 940 CFS, the 25-year is 3,500, the 100-year is 10,200 CFS. We've put those numbers together, and then with those discharges, we can run a hydraulics model where we take the lay of the land, the topography of the land uses, and we run some models, and that gives us the depths, the velocities, the inundation, and helps us define the flood limit. So that's where these local floodplains come from. It's the 100-year water surface over the land making a flood limit. This is the same thing as is upstream. This is the 10X area, and just showing again the overlay, but we did this whole thing all the way upstream through the town of Tusayan, and wherever the Zone A floodplain was, we extended our mapping up through there too. I'll talk real quick about the 2023 event. Everybody here is well aware of it, but just to help keep us in memory of it. That event happened in August of 2023. It was about a 6-hour rainfall event, hit the watershed. There had been some lead up to it, but it was generally dry soils at the time. And you had water that hit, or rain that hit the watershed anywhere from a ½ inch of depth to about 3.5 inches of depth. And so that the centroid of the water hit mid-watershed. It was about 3.5 inches of rainfall that fell in 6 hours. And that's about a 25-year rainfall of depth. But when that mass of water translated downstream, and then with the lower rainfall depths in the entire watershed, the discharge that we got in town, there's the gauge that you guys have by the treatment plant, that discharge was 1,400 cubic feet per second. So what is 1,400 cubic feet per second? If you compare that, that's enough water to fill an Olympic swimming pool in a minute. It's 630 fire hydrants fully open. It has the same mass as a semi going by that every second. So it's a lot of water, mass-wise, volume-wise. And that's only 1,400 CFS. If we look at what we're designing the 100-year floodplain, that's 10,200 CFS. So it's order of magnitude difference. It's a lot of water. This is the Zone A floodplain again here in town, and we did some analyses looking at how many parcels are flooded currently. So in town now, there's currently 21 parcels that are in the Zone A floodplain, and within those, there's 49 permanent structures. In the proposed local floodplain, we go to 54 parcels and 71 permanent structures within that floodplain. So we put them together. Lucinda mentioned the floodplain ordinance is being revised. The way that ordinance is being revised, the current floodplain ordinance touches on the district having responsibility for FEMA floodplains. So currently the district has responsibility for this blue area, for the FEMA floodplains. The ordinance is being revised, and it looks a lot like other ordinances throughout the state, where instead of just being FEMA floodplains, it's what's called regulatory floodplains. And so a regulatory floodplain will now include local floodplains and FEMA floodplains, both of those. And this is something that's done by agencies all throughout the state. Other counties do it. The city of Flagstaff has two local floodplains. It's commonly used, and a local floodplain, it's an interesting term, but what it means is it's a floodplain recognized by the local agency. So where a FEMA floodplain is recognized federally by FEMA, a local floodplain is not recognized by FEMA, it's recognized here by Coconino County, by the local agency. That's what the term local means.
Give some more examples of other communities, because I know there was a question that got asked about others. I know
Sedona has some.
I know Yavapai County does.
Yeah.
Cheese County. Are there other examples, John? Jack,
Yep. Yeah. Yeah, and I know Pima County has them. They're all over the state, and they're regulated differently. I know Flagstaff, they have 2 local floodplains, and each one has its own rules and requirements, which is kind of an interesting way to do it. But there's a lot of them all over the state. Yeah, yeah, and there's reasons to have local floodplains instead of a FEMA floodplain. I'll touch on that real quick. So, you know, the district has recognized that there's a floodplain here. And so generally what you would do with that is say, okay, we're going to go back to FEMA. We're going to say, FEMA, your floodplain's wrong. We're going to do a letter map revision request. And if you go through that whole process, in the end, what you'll get is a new floodplain. You'll take the old floodplain that's wrong and you'll replace with the new floodplain that's correct. The problem with that is it's a long, as Lucinda hit on, it's a long process. It could take us 4 years to get there. And in that 4-year period of time, you still have land that's in a floodplain where people don't really recognize that risk. So the solution is develop a local floodplain, either as a interim measure until that letter map revision is granted, or you just do that instead of a letter map revision. Both are effective ways to do it. All right. Just touch on real quick, many of you aware, what we did here is we did some analyses in GIS figuring out what parcels are in the floodplain, in the Zone A floodplain, what are in the local floodplain, who do we reach out to, who do we coordinate with and tell landowners, here's what's happening, here's why it's happening, and kind of give a one-on-one explanation of what's going on. So that's what we did with this information here. So 2 more slides, and what I'm going to touch on is what does this mean? And the first question is, what about flood insurance? So if you're in a Zone A floodplain, if you're in any FEMA floodplain, you get a federally backed mortgage, you're required federally to have a flood insurance policy. If you're in a local floodplain, there is no such requirement for that. It doesn't mean you can't have it. You should. It's recommended, but it's your choice. If you buy a property in a FEMA floodplain, there's mechanisms, there's triggers to tell you that you're in a FEMA floodplain, and if you get insurance or you buy that property, you're told you need insurance. If you're in a local floodplain, that doesn't happen. So that is one negative of local floodplains. And so as a buyer, you just need to be more aware that there's tools to look into whether there's a local floodplain or not. But what advantage of this is, if you're in the local floodplain and you're not in the FEMA floodplain, it's very likely that your flood insurance premiums will be a little lower. Zone A premiums are very high. If you're outside of that and you're in the local floodplain, you probably get a cheaper policy. In the last slide, what are the implications? So currently, if you're in that Zone A floodplain, you go to develop, you go to remodel, you're going to go to the flood control district, you're going to obtain currently, you'd have to bring in your own model. You'd have to hire an engineer to figure out the discharge, figure out what is the water surface elevation, and there's this back and forth of, my engineer says it's this, the district has to review and approve it, and the district might think, well, maybe not, and there's this back and forth. Now, if you're in the Zone A floodplain, there's this study that J.E. Fuller's done, the district has adopted, that is the best available data. You just grab that, give it to your engineer takes that model, they tell you, here's the water surface elevation, and then because it's in a FEMA floodplain, you would go ahead and go through the process of going through FEMA and all of that. If you're in a local floodplain, the difference is you only go to the district. You don't need to go to FEMA. There's no federal requirement for that. So your process will be, go to the district, we're going to do this analysis, we're going to show that our property's elevated, but you're also going to do the whole no adverse impact analysis, those kinds of things. So similar requirements to FEMA floodplains, but not going all the way to FEMA. So with that, that is what I had. Are there any questions for me?
John, we're going to talk about the fact that we're not going to establish a floodway like that.
Yeah, so that's a question. And I'll explain what a floodway is real quick. So historically, there's what's called the floodplain. So the floodplain is the line on the map saying here's where water goes. A floodway is an administrative tool that FEMA set up years ago to basically say, here's the most important part of a river, of a stream or whatnot that we do not want to develop. And it works really, really well in undeveloped areas. It's horrible in Tusayan. So if you try to put a floodway in Tusayan, what you're going to do is basically take the floodplain and say most of it's a floodway. In a floodway, you cannot do much development at all. It's really, really hard to develop. And so the goal is, if this were to go to FEMA, this would not have a floodway. Usually FEMA would agree that if the local agency doesn't want a floodway, the FEMA's not going to require that of you. Local floodplains don't have a floodway, and if you ever have a floodway, it's really hard to remove it, almost impossible, if not impossible. So yeah, that's a good question. There's not going to be a floodway on this.
I have one other question.
Yeah.
So when you were talking about the structure, changes, the amount of them, are mobile homes considered permanent structures or not?
I don't think we included those. So the analysis we did, it was permanent structures provided by Bing mapping, so it's plus or minus. So yeah, I don't believe there were any mobile homes in that.
Okay.
That's a good question though.
Thanks.
All right.
So with that, I think that was, let's go to the next. There's a slide here. And so here's a little bit, I shared some of this earlier, but we've been, some of you are aware that we've been reaching out to many of the property owners directly. We also did a letter out to everyone, a letter that had the 3 maps that showed the local floodplain extent, the FEMA floodplain if that existed on the property, as well as the overlap. And then we had a frequently asked questions piece that went in that packet. And so those were all sent out about a week or so ago now to all the property owners. Trying, making sure that people were aware of the process. And then we've had individual meetings with some of the property owners as well. And we're willing to meet individually with anyone. And we'll make ourselves available to do that. And it may take multiple meetings, and that's fine too. But if there are specific questions, we put down John's email address. I think most of you know how to get a hold of me as well, and we're happy to meet with anyone. And then there's the virtual meetings for the board meetings for the 9th. If you want to not come in and tune in through YouTube, that's the actual link for all of the county's board meetings. It's a standing link to get to the board meetings. So, yeah, Tom. Hang on for the question so we can pick that up.
Thank you.
Thank you. Tom DiPaolo, Stilo Development, Phoenix, Arizona. As a result, I think this is great, but as a result of a local floodplain designation, we have people living on our properties. Do we have any responsibility as a result of this to protect the existing? Does the county, now that you've identified a risk, does the county or town have any obligation or liability to protect the public? How does that all come together? How does that work?
I would, I'm not an attorney, so I will say that right off the bat. I'm not an attorney, and I'm not going to answer that from a legal perspective, but I would say that there's no strict, just like FEMA has no requirement. They've had a floodplain here for 40, 50 years, and they have had no requirement. There's no requirement then placed on us by FEMA or any other entity that we have to then mitigate that risk, right? Now we're working hand in hand with the town to hopefully effectuate mitigation, right? That's the goal. And that's another goal here. My personal hope is that we don't go to FEMA and change the FEMA floodplain until we have the mitigation done. That may or may not happen. We may end up having to do that at some point, but no, there's no specific obligation. But as the chair said, I think morally we're trying to take the right steps to mitigate these impacts. And you've seen the proposal. Much of that area you're referring to now would come out of the floodplain completely. A portion of that property would come out of the floodplain.
Yeah, I'm more concerned about people living there now. Now that a risk's been identified.
It's
Is
certainly
there an
something
obligation for any of us to do something?
Tom, I have to refer you to your attorney to look at it and say, is there an obligation or not? I certainly would strongly encourage anyone that's in the local floodplain and or FEMA floodplain that they have insurance, because there's no way to, there's no other source of funding for any damage that's incurred.
Yeah, it's more the public safety, not the houses. The houses can be replaced.
And I think that's part of what we are looking at as well. But I'll tell you, to stand up like an emergency notification system is a huge exercise. And we've done that for our post-wildfire areas because we get very severe, repetitive, post-wildfire flooding, which is, think about this and add 10 to 30 times onto it, right? Yeah. And in those areas we have done it, we've set up the gauges and done, but it's 24-hour staffing. It's a huge effort to try to do that. We did just had an agreement now with the town. They had 2 gauges here in town. We're taking over the ownership and maintenance of those. And we'll probably look at getting some additional gauges that would help us at least understand and work more effectively in an event with like the National Weather Service. Because frankly, we're mostly dependent on them when these events happen, because the radar tells us more accurately up front, right? What's happening, with the rainfall. And that's when they went back and corroborated the study with the event in 2023. They used a lot of that Weather Service radar, So, but yeah, no, I think that I know that there have been some property owners, and that Chris Duza did come out and meet with some of the property owners to look at should they put in some concrete barriers. And I do have, if anyone would like concrete barriers, we'll figure out a way. I don't have funding right now to get them out there, but I have a lot of them. I have 4.5 miles sitting out in the Timberline area, and we just pretty much finished all the projects, and a lot of those people now are ready to be done with their concrete barriers. And so we do have some of the mitigation measures. Typically, we work with the fire districts coming into monsoon season and make sure that they have a stash of sandbags, to help people. But, in a major event, it's going to be really, this is going to be a very impactful event, very impactful. And people think, well, if we have a big event, then FEMA will come in and rescue all of us. Oh, don't think that. For FEMA, first you have to qualify. You have to meet a certain level of damage to qualify, and you have to have a certain number of homes destroyed to be able to qualify for individual assistance. And if you qualify for individual assistance, the max you can get is $32,000. There isn't a structure in town, maybe than somebody's shed, that's worth $32,000, right? So certainly there are no homes. That's where it comes back to flood insurance and having flood insurance. And we should be encouraging renters can get flood insurance as well to get flood insurance. Yeah.
More people in other housing since this event that have gotten renters insurance as well.
Yeah.
The
And
infrastructure.
you got to work with your attorney to do that assessment based on your properties and what the situation is. But even with the barriers, it's a challenge in a densely populated area, because we went through this, with the new town manager in Flagstaff in a dense area. And, if you mitigate one area, do you then push water to another house, right? You've got to be really conscious. You have to really have a plan that you're not impacting residents either upstream or properties upstream or downstream when you do that. So it's not just go out and throw these things up wherever you feel like, because you might be creating more liability for yourself, right? But I really encourage everyone to go onto this new application that we have online and look at your properties. I mean, I think that's what's important, and then that will help you assess what you might want to do in terms of any kind of pre-disaster mitigation. I also want to provide an opportunity for the town engineer, Jack Moody. Jack has been a party to all these discussions and conversation, and very, frankly, very influential, because it certainly behooves us that the town and the district, although the district has the flood authority, to work together on these types of issues. So I want to provide Jack with an opportunity to speak to this and how he views it. And if there are more questions, we can keep doing questions after that. You may have specific questions for Jack too.
Thank you, Lucinda. Mayor, Council, thank you for allowing me to speak. As the town engineer, I look at this from the standpoint of protecting the town's interests. And we've known long before this study that the FEMA mapping was not very accurate. We didn't know how inaccurate it was, but we knew it wasn't accurate. And as Lucinda said, that's a very common thing. You see that all over the place. When this, the approximate zone A flooding, as Ian indicated, it's based on the USGS topographic mapping, 10-foot contour interval. That to be compared with the mapping that was used for the new study, which is 1-foot contour interval, and probably a little better than that based on the type of DTM we had. So it's definitely a lot better information, and so we are coming up with just even information based on the topography much more accurate. That being said, when the Coconino County Flood Control District decided to do this, or when they did this, they spent, of course, as you know, as Lucinda said, a couple $100,000 to do this study. It's a big study. There's a lot that goes into it. During that study and following that study, the town had an opportunity to review it. Lucinda, or I'm sorry, the Coconino County Flood Control District hired a third-party reviewer. It was Atkins, Linda Potter, a longtime drainage engineer who's well-respected in the drainage community, a flood control community, did a third-party review of the study to see did it follow all of the standards that are required by FEMA, as well as industry standards. And that study of the study came to the conclusion that yes, it did indeed follow industry standards, and it did follow FEMA standards. After Atkins and Linda did that study, the town and the town engineer, I had an opportunity to review not only the Atkins review of the study, but also the study that produced these new floodplains. And again, I looked at it for very similar to the reason that Atkins and Linda Potter looked at it, and that was, does it meet current standards? Does it follow industry standards for what we're doing? Does it meet FEMA standards? And indeed, I came to the conclusion that it indeed meets FEMA standards and it meets current industry standards. So I looked at this study and I said, okay, I can give my stamp of approval that yes, this does represent, reasonably represents the flood hazard that's out there. And more importantly, it significantly improves the understanding of the flood hazards over the original FEMA mapping. So with that, as representing the town, concluded that indeed it is a better representation, and therefore it does get the nomenclature of best available data. And we use that term best available data, but that is a very important term, and it's a FEMA term. And when any work is done in a floodplain, especially at approximate floodplain, that would be the Zone A's, Zone A, special flood hazard area, the FEMA floodplains, FEMA requires the applicant, the engineer, to use the best available data. Now we have that data. An engineer doesn't have to go out and recreate it, as was said earlier. So that, to me, is very important, and it really ties in nicely to what FEMA is going to require us to do. Now, that being said, even prior to turning this study into a local floodplain, which we're in the process, or which Coconino County Flood Control District is in the process of doing right now, the town has been using this study for the last, probably a year to 2 years, since it became available. Even before we had done the review of it, has been using it as the best available data. So any development or redevelopment that was proposed, the town is requiring, we have been requiring them to use this study and to make appropriate measures to protect new development or redevelopment to the level of this study. I should say new development, to the level of this study. We had, in some situations, we received pushback on that and held firm that it was very important that they stick to that. And then after the 2023 event, the August 2023 event, the people who were giving pushback kind of got a really understanding that, boy, I'm glad they did do some flood proofing to that level, which is a good tie-in to what we can do. We talked a lot about development, and of course, in the town, there is a potential for development and redevelopment to come through the town. And as Lucinda indicated, the purpose of this is not to stop development, slow development, change, hinder development in any way. The purpose of this local floodplain, as is the purpose of FEMA floodplains, is to provide the data so that development can happen with some good intelligence and can protect from the potential flood hazard. And so, FEMA doesn't stop development in a floodplain, but they want it to occur. They want smart development to occur, and therefore they want to protect from that hazard. When you're talking about residential development, protection means elevation above the base flood, above the 100-year flood elevation. When you're talking about commercial structures, you're allowed to either elevate or flood-proof, meaning you can put a barrier around the commercial property, and it can be a barrier that doesn't require anybody coming in and making a change, or a barrier that does require changes in order to putting gates down, things like that, in order to protect the property. So that's something that's very important to know, that all the commercial areas do have the opportunity to flood proof as opposed to just elevate. Very important. Another point I wanted to bring up is Lucinda talked about the requirement for flood insurance in a special flood hazard area, that meaning the FEMA floodplain, the Zone A floodplain, and how that is not an actual requirement in the local floodplain, unless, of course, where they overlap and you're in both, then of course would be a requirement. But as Lucinda and Ian said, it's still a good idea. It's a good idea to get that flood insurance. And when I said flood requirement, it's only a requirement if you are getting any sort of federal assistance, and where it really ties into is a federally backed loan. In other words, a loan from a bank that's FDIC insured. That would be a federally backed loan, and that would trigger the requirement for the flood insurance in the special flood hazard area, but not in the local floodplain. Also, I wanted to point out that there are several properties or areas that are in the FEMA special flood hazard area, the FEMA Zone A floodplain, that will not be in the local floodplain. Now, as long as the FEMA floodplain is there, they have to deal with the FEMA requirements. But there is the opportunity to go through a letter of map revision process. And there's a couple of different processes you can do that. And whether you do a full-out letter of map revision or a letter of map amendment, two things, and there's different levels to how difficult those are. The good news is this study offers all the baseline in order to go through that process. When you're going through that process, it requires the best available data, it requires a water surface elevation. This study provides that. So you can look at some of the area in that breakout that we saw on the map that isn't going to be in the future floodplain, and say they might be able to go through this LOMA letter of map amendment process. It doesn't necessarily change the map, but it can remove the property. And to go for a full-out map revision takes a long time, costs a decent amount of money. But to go through the letter of map amendment process, it's actually quicker and much less expensive, and this data helps tremendously. And you had one more thing you wanted me to mention.
Just that if the person wanted to use the best available data and they don't agree with it, they can go and...
Thank you. Yes. Yeah, and so whereas this best available data and Coconino County Flood Control District spent a lot of money to prepare this data and do it, if somebody thinks it doesn't properly represent what's happening on their specific property, they do have the opportunity and the option to go in and hire an engineer and have that engineer restudy it or study that area. It could be better data that they would restudy that. For example, let's say between the time that the topographic mapping was done and the study, and now the study is complete, they've pushed some dirt around. They've elevated a building pad that elevated their house up above the floodplain, but of course it doesn't show on that topo from, I believe that topo is about 6 or 7 years old. It doesn't show up on that topo. That's a way they can go in and study. So there is the opportunity to go in and restudy what was done here, even restudy all the, the the entirety of the project and the hydrology, hydraulics, all of that. That opportunity, that option is still out there. Now, understand that a lot went into this study, and it's going to be looked at as the starting point, and any new study is going to have to prove where this study might have gone wrong, either new data or just where there was an incorrect or some mistake made. So that is a point that can be made as you go through. A last point I want to touch on is the point Ian made about not putting a floodway on this property. To me, that's very important. I've done many studies similar to this study here that have chosen not to identify a floodway for the very reason that this study is choosing not to identify a floodway. Since the floodway, and summarizing what Ian said, is that portion of the floodplain that is reserved for conveyance. It's that area that takes the majority of the water, which usually is in a normal riverine section. It's usually the center of the river. Well, here it sheet flows out and around, so there is no well-defined conveyance corridor. By not having that floodway, it helps from the standpoint of if an owner is redeveloping his property, their FEMA, and this applies to FEMA, and I don't know if it'll actually apply to the local floodplain, but it.
Yeah, I guess it would.
The 50%.
Yeah.
So it will. Okay. Yeah. So it will apply to the local floodplain also. So if you are going to redevelop your property, if that redevelopment is more than 50% the value of the structure, not the land, but the structure itself, then it kicks it into the whole property has to be brought up to FEMA standards. In other words, you have to elevate or floodproof to that 1 foot above the base foot elevation. If there's a floodway, let me take a step back before I get to that point. That also applies to if there is a disaster to the property. And you're not just upgrading your business, but there's a disaster. You have a fire, and you have a lot of damage from a fire, and you go to rebuild that. If the rebuilding of that is greater than 50% of the value of the structure, then it kicks it in to following the current FEMA regulations as well as following the current local floodplain regulations. Now, where that really becomes an issue is if there were to be a floodway identified on this. Since the floodway is the area reserved for flood conveyance, FEMA does not want buildings to go in there to stop flood conveyance. So if your house or your structure burns more than 50%, then there's an issue of you having a very, very difficult time and potentially not even be allowed to reconstruct in that location. That's if there's a floodway. That is, in my opinion, and I, as we were discussing this, I spoke out strongly, and I didn't have to. Everybody agreed, but I spoke out strongly that we don't want a floodway on this because of the existing structures this goes through. So that's a very, very important point. So with that, does anybody have any questions for me?
Or any questions overall?
I have one. What you just mentioned about the 50% of value of a structure?
Yes.
Who sets that? The assessor's department?
So, of course, it's a FEMA regulation, as I said, that's not your question. But there are very specific guidelines that FEMA sets out on how you identify what's 50% of that value. And so I personally haven't gone through that. I don't know if you have.
Yeah.
But you want to answer that question? Thank you.
We typically go by the people can get a private assessor to find out how much the house is worth, or they can go to the county assessor, which is typically lower. So a lot of times they'll want to get their own assessment. And then they have to, as you mentioned, it's only the structure itself, and they have to include all costs, all labor, all parts, and yeah.
one more piece point of information, and I will stop because I could keep talking forever. One more point of information is one thing that this study, the local floodplain, really helps is if you've got a parcel and a portion of it's in the new local floodplain and a portion of it's outside that new local floodplain, it really directs you to that information. I mean, we might all intuitively know, my grandmother always said, you build high, you build your house on the high ground. And intuitively, that makes sense. But sometimes when you get in there and you look at the beautiful view, you might forget that. And I've seen it many times when people forget that. Well, then when you come to this map and you'll say, boy, if I build my house here, I'm putting it on stilts. Or if I build it over here, it's just slab on grade, or it's built more normal, typical construction techniques. And that is really like the first step when someone looks at a development of a parcel is to look at these maps and determine where's the best place to build. And then if you wind up having to build in the floodplain, how high do I need to build or floodproof to?
All right, any other questions about process or regulations or anything else? Anybody have any other questions? And again, we're happy to meet with people, as many meetings as we need to have to go through it and talk through it. And I want to go back to Tom's question about the, pre-flood, we're happy to work with you. If people have a concern about existing properties and being prepared for, flooding, I can have somebody work with you to look at what might be some measures. I can't do it for you, but I can help you look at it. So
where it came up, and I think it applies to all of us. You remember I think it's called the Surfside in Florida, the condominium tower that collapsed? Mm-hmm. The county came along and they concluded, at least this is what we're told by council, that once they understood that type of construction was vulnerable, they went up and down that corridor and they went to every one of those condos and said, you have to retrofit. It created huge problems for people that retired, bought units at very small, and they were getting assessed for $100,000. They paid $50,000 for the unit. Point being that county concluded because the risk was identified, they had a liability. I'm no lawyer.
that the property owner had a liability.
No, the county. The
county had a liability.
The county attorney concluded the county, having identified the problem, had a responsibility to then go and protect the public by going to the different building owners and say you have to retrofit. I don't know that that's true or not true. I mean, I know it's true that it happened. Whether or not a court would say they did or didn't, right, who knows? But that's what's prompting, and our group, they're paranoid about, all kinds of the U.S. legal system. So I just ask if that's been reviewed by the county attorney, and then it would apply to us as well, obviously, and perhaps the town, I don't know. But that's what prompted the question. I can certainly
ask the district attorney to look at, is there any case law that would support that? I just look at the FEMA, most of our regulatory authority comes through FEMA, right? That's why we are in existence in Arizona, was because FEMA came to the states and said, you need to figure out how to take some responsibility to support the implementation and regulation of the National Flood Insurance and the National Flood Insurance Program. And they certainly don't have any obligation, irrespective of how bad the threat is. So I wouldn't expect that would fall to us, but again, I'm not an attorney.
Just asking the question, because I don't know. Okay, thank you.
Jack.
Minor addressing of that. So as Lucinda said, FEMA has many times, I've worked on many flood insurance studies both for FEMA directly and for counties and cities. And quite often we identify a floodplain, or we identify structures within a floodplain. And I haven't seen to date on any of those where FEMA, the county or the city that commissioned this study has gone back and taken any sort of liability for those things. They basically said, we've identified the floodplain and the structures that are identified in the floodplain. They stay and they're allowed to stay. They are, pre-existing prior to the study, and so they, as I said earlier, they're not required to elevate or come up to the current standard unless, of course, they trigger that 50%. But I haven't seen FEMA take responsibility, or I haven't seen FEMA go down that line, similar to what you're saying about the structural in Florida there, or different counties, and I've worked in Yavapai County, Maricopa County, as well as some cities. You're welcome. I do want to make one more point, and I'm sorry I keep talking about this. Will be my last point. I said the town has been utilizing this study for since it was identified and since it became the best available data in our eyes. Even to the extent of the town, as we all know, is working on a new town hall, and that town hall is, as it goes to design, it has to respect this study, and it is respecting this study. So the town isn't making an exception for our own development. We are imposing the same regulations that on any other development, and so I think that's an important point.
Absolutely. I think that's a really important point, John. We don't want to see things coming that we've watched the same kind of flooding to happen in 2022. But John?
John Thurston, 291 RP Drive. I'm curious as to why parametric insurance isn't discussed more in this stuff. Can someone give me an answer to that?
Yeah, John, you raised this before at one of the prior meetings, and that is a product that's out there it's very new to the market, and it is, a potential for individual property owners to consider, that as a product. There are a number of products in the flood insurance market now that did not exist 10, 15 years ago. When we had Schultz, it was the National Flood Insurance Program, and I know when we had Pipeline in 22 and people were out on the market, I frankly was really amazed at how many different products are out there now. And it probably, the product isn't that different, but a lot of different entities. Lloyd's of London, several other entities are doing products. Parametric isn't an insurance product. It acts like insurance, but it's a hedge. It's a financial hedge. And I come out of the energy industry, so I know a little bit about those. And but for the district wouldn't be in that role. The property owner would utilize a system like that. If you wanted to have greater coverage than you can get through the National Flood Insurance Program, because it is capped, and you can't, and that's the best product for you, then that's something you should absolutely consider. We've looked at it in terms of ensuring our mitigation, our flood mitigation measures that we have, most of which, the vast majority of which are in the post-wildfire flood area, as an alternative, because right now the county has general coverage under a group buying program called ASIP, and those facilities have either zero or very limited coverage. So we've looked at paramedic, but that's only for the infrastructure, not for individual properties. So, but it's something that could be looked at. I mean, it's being looked at with climate change, and a lot of it's being used. I know state of Utah has a parametric insurance policy for earthquake after the earthquake they went through in Salt Lake a few years ago. And some of the government entities are utilizing that instrument. So, but it's for their assets primarily. So, thank you.
Any
Chris Thurston, 123 LA Lane. The question I've got is, what is so necessary about this if the town is already holding property owners to a standard of building above the floodplain? Why is this necessary?
Because the flood control district, though, doesn't have any authority to hold the parties. So, you know, that's what I'm saying. I think we want to work in tandem here and have a similar approach, obviously, right? And it's a way for us to regulate the development, you know, that reflects the actual risk. And that's important. That's important that we're reflecting the actual risks so that we can work with property owners to try to address that risk.
I think that the town holding people to that standard is addressing the risk.
Yep.
The town has delegated floodplain authority to the Coconino County Flood Control District. And so by delegating floodplain authority, to us, it makes sense that they also are delegated the proper risk. So the town has made that decision years ago to delegate floodplain authority. And we've seen situations where a parcel is not in the FEMA designated floodplain, but in the high risk area of the local, what will be the local floodplain, and it's something that just has to come down to the town, when in reality it's better to give it to the flood control district who has authority over the floodplains. So I think that's the real answer, is that we've delegated floodplain authority, so it makes sense that they also are regulating to the proper floodplain.
Okay, and one other question.
The alternative is to go to FEMA and remap. That's the alternative. And so, but that's a very extended process. And frankly, it may open some doors and issues that will complicate the process, that frankly won't be a benefit to the community necessarily. And it's very expensive and exhausting, but you end up in the same place, right? So, yeah.
Okay, and why does it not make sense to hold off on this aspect of it until after the mitigation measures have been implemented?
Because the risk exists now, and it may take us years to get the mitigation. We don't know how long it'll take to secure the tens of millions of dollars it's going to take to implement the mitigation. I mean, the town's made a decision to go after, you know, a grant already, one that's available, and they're pursuing that, and we're supporting them 100% with that. And I'm working with the park to get their endorsement. It's a federal Lands Access Program grant, and so we're going to go after every grant we can. I think we're going to have a very strong case to make, that these projects are very vital to a huge economic engine for the entire Southwest. So, you know, we're going to make that case, and we've got some experience in that arena. We've with the post-wildfire flood, we're up at about $132 million in mitigation. Now, that was a true disaster, right? That had happened. But I think there's a lot of confidence in our ability to manage projects of this complexity and this size, and I think we'll make a very good case. Now, this particular timing with this specific grant may or may not come forward. We'll see. You know, they're maxed out. What we understand is the only amount of grant that's available for Arizona projects right now is maxed at $30 million. So we're going to make an application for what we can and do with that, and try to get something done and start chipping away at that. So,
okay,
but we need to not that you create worse risks by not regulating to the known floodplain and the known risks now.
But
just
you're already
creating
doing
more
that.
risks.
That's what I've been told here.
The town is, the flood control district isn't.
Okay, well, the town is, that's the most local control you can get.
but they don't have as much, they don't have the direct floodplain authority. The district does.
So then
So-
they shouldn't have done what they did with the McDonald's. I guess that's the one we're all talking about that was
Well,
required.
they have their authority over development, and they have a certain level of authority, and we have a certain level of authority. And we're going to work together to utilize that authority so we don't create more properties at risk as we implement the mitigation plan.
I don't mean to beat a dead horse here.
Yeah, I mean,
But what I'm telling
yeah.
you is that
Yeah.
most local control you
Well,
can
we can
get
agree to disagree,
is
Chris.
right here. Well, that's
Yeah.
fine. But it still doesn't, McDonald's was held to a high standard, rightfully so, and I think they realize they benefit from that.
They did benefit.
And other properties, if they're held to the same standard, they'll benefit too.
Correct. This gives us the legal authority to do that. We had to hope, and it took how long with McDonald's? Over a year? Yeah. It took a long time that they eventually made the decision that they would comply, right?
Okay. Well,
And
I
so-
think after this flood, everybody kind of realizes
Yeah,
that that's
no, I
probably
think that's,
the best
you know,
route to take.
Yeah,
I did want to add that to what she's saying, though, is that they made the decision to comply with those.
they made the decision.
That there
Right.
could be people that maybe wanted to build to the 3,000, and then their building might just wash away before this was,
Right. I mean, we're just creating more and more risk.
fight it, it could be a different scenario. But they would have-
And, yeah, it's
Okay.
ethically and morally,
Thank you.
that's not the right position, to take. And ultimately, it will be a board decision. But I think they've been very clear that one thing we've been really benefited from, and this is a benefit in getting that $130 million worth of federal money, is that we have stuck to the science through the entire process. Everything we've done, we've stuck to the science. And you either created new science or, improved science or created science. We're now the national leader in post-wildfire flood mitigation. And that's because we invested in the science to understand it, to know what to do to try to mitigate it, what to do to try to prevent it. We're have a leadership role in that, but it's because we use the science, and people are respond to that. And so this is just another example of where the board sees the science and says, we need to use the best available science that we can to make sure that we're providing public safety. This is all about public safety and benefit. So, all right, well, thank you so much. Thank you, council, for some additional time today again, and appreciate always working with you. We've just, I think really I feel personally blessed to be able to work with you and be able to try to accomplish, creating a safer Tusayan and a secure and long-term economy, right? That's a big element of this, so thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lucinda. I think one other point that I would add too is that in the stuff that she was talking about with the road, I'm sorry, is just people remembering that the road was blocked going into Grand Canyon. And so some of the ADOT and some of the other smart grants and things that we've been able to accomplish was because of the impact to Highway 64.
The project that we're putting forward for this grant, that's going to be the title.
Yes, yeah. So,
Ensuring access to the Grand Canyon National Park. Right?
yeah, yeah. Go ahead, Chris.
Do we have an estimate of what the cost would be for the mitigation? Do you want me to repeat that?
Sorry.
Right now, it's rough. We're working on some costs right now for this grant. I think for the measures in town, rough right now is 25 to 35 million. That would include the storm drains that have been proposed and their inlets, and then the channel along the wastewater treatment plant. And that's probably today's costs, knowing that construction escalation's been pretty significant. It's calmed a bit, but last few years have been pretty significant. The on-force measures, the large flood retarding structures, that we haven't generated any kind of estimate for that, but it's a lot.
If the,
It's a lot. It's going to be a lot. It's going to be
Right.
definitely tens of millions. the geotechnical and why we're harping on everybody to get your right of entries is that the geotechnical studies, particularly for the measures in town, they're very important. Frankly, the utility location information in town, Ben knows, is really important to secure, to understanding, better nailing down the cost for the in-town measures. That's probably the most vulnerable element. On forest, it's the geology, the soil conditions, because you have to tie in these flood retarding structures to solid, to rock, to some type of bedrock system so that it will hold, right, in the conditions. And ADWR will regulate these facilities, very likely, at least the Tusayan Pines one for sure, as will the Forest Service, but ADWR, and they have very strict requirements. So that testing, and then the cost will be very much influenced by whether we can use local soils. Can we excavate some material and use that to construct these facilities, or do we have to haul that all in from somewhere? And the core likely will have to be hauled in, so that'll be a cost factor. So we've got to do more engineering and get that geotechnical information before we can really start putting more, even a range to those costs of those facilities.
Okay, and if, I think you said the grant was like for 30 million that we're trying to
That's the
get?
max they apparently have for Arizona.
Okay.
That's this one grant.
So if we were
One
able to get
Department
all
of
of that, that
Transportation.
may or may not cover the cost of the improvements in town.
Right.
What happens if it comes up 15 million short? Does that get assessed to the properties?
That's a future discussion that the community.
Well, I think that needs to be more of a present discussion than future, because I don't want to get into this thing and all of a sudden we're being assessed for $15 million worth of
But as you
improvements.
go and you look for other grants and you look at, this grant has no match requirement, so there's not an issue right now, because technically we could get 100% grant potentially, right? So that conversation, but there will have to be a conversation once we get further in the engineering process and we're further into that process and really understand what's going to be involved. That will be a conversation, is what is the overarching cost? What do we think are the grant opportunities? What are the match requirements going to be, and where's that match going to come from? And there are, equity issues will come into this discussion. About, there are parties that are going to directly benefit. There are parties that will indirectly benefit, but still are going to benefit financially. Their properties will go up in value. They'll have the flood mitigation if there's an event to the park, right? So that people can still access the park. And so all that discussion will have to take place, both with the district board and with the town council. That'll be a big discussion. Yeah.
To looking at your question, let's say we ask for 30 million, we get 15 million. There are components to the recommended alternative. And so you can build portions of those, components of that overall thing. So you can take 15 million as the example, and you could build the outfall channel past the wastewater treatment plant. Or you could build just the pipes going through town, or whatever fits that will operate independently. Certainly when you build these things, it's always nicest to build from the bottom up. But if you are building pipes through town that take a few thousand CFS, and the existing channel can handle a few thousand CFS, then there is a piece of it you could build. And so now you've got a part of it built that does good. You don't want to build a piece that has a negative impact. Right, you don't want to build a piece that has a bathtub stopper at the downstream end. And so we would look at that, and then you could say on your going after the next grant that, listen, we have this much of it built. Now, instead of needing $30 million or $35 million, we need $20 million or $15 million. So it does help, even if we don't get the entire amount at this time. Thank you. You're welcome.
Thanks, Jack. Okay, any other questions? Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Jack. Thank you, Lucinda. Thank you, John, everybody, Ian, everybody. Thank you all for coming. Okay, so we are moving on to item 6.